You've worked hard today as well. A place for your weary heart to rest for a while. This is Slow Night Sleepy Stories. The tale we will share tonight is Kim You-jeong's short story, A Shower, carrying the deep scent of the earth and the sound of heavy rain. Just as the rough, unpolished lives of the people of the past and the sorrowful fragments intertwined within them are washed away by the sound of the rain, I hope this old story quietly lingers by your side and brings you comfort. Now pull your blanket up cozily and gently close your eyes. On this slow night, our old tale begins now. A Shower author, Kim You-jeong. Gloomy black clouds gathered and billowed in the sky, looking as though they would pour down a stream of rain at any moment. Yet the spiteful rays of the sun were still heating the secluded village, hidden deep within the layered mountains, as if to swallow it whole. Occasionally, as if remembering to do so, the possessed wind blew madly, shaking the trees between the rice paddies and fields. The air in the inner village, which had sent its farmers far outside the mountains for communal labor, was desolate. There was only the heartbreaking song of cicadas from the grove of tall, slender poplar trees, as if reciting the harshness of the declining farming village. Mayum. Mayum. Chun-ho was sitting on the threshold of his room, in the old, rotting shack he had bought and moved into this spring for 5-1, resting his chin on his right fist and silently glaring at his wife, who was washing potatoes in the dirt floor entry room to make do for dinner. His face, already withered from farming, was even paler because he hadn't slept a wink for 3 or 4 nights out of sheer frustration. He badgered his wife once more, but in a threatening tone. "Hey, so are you really not going to get me just 2-1? His wife, as expected, gave no answer. She just kept washing the potatoes, staying perfectly silent like a newlywed bride who had just been dragged in. Whether it was possible or not, since she said absolutely nothing either way, Chun-ho was about to die of exasperation. Since he was a wanderer from another place, there was no one who trusted him enough to lend him money with high interest. And even if he tried to sell that pathetic house, no buyer would step forward to offer even 2 or 3-1, so he was completely blocked on all sides. Still, since his wife was young and had a pretty face, he figured she could somehow manage to get about 2-1, which was why he was asking, but seeing her pretend not to even hear him made him feel she was detestable. Sticking out his belly, he asked once more, "Are you going to get me the money or not?" he shrieked. But there was still no reply. Filled with rage, Chun-ho suddenly pushed off the threshold and leaped to his feet. Glaring fiercely, he grabbed the A-frame carrier stick leaning against the wall and lunged at his wife like the wind. "You bitch! What good is having a wife? You're supposed to relieve your husband's worries. Are you just a wife to hold and sleep with?" The carrier stick struck his wife's tender waist mercilessly. Her fading scream escaped the cruelly crushed fence. Then the stick aimed at the heel of his wife, who had tumbled over from her sitting position, and whipped down hard on her buttocks. "You bitch! How long have I been begging you?" As the husband roared like a tiger and mercilessly raised the stick into the air again, his wife let out a single shriek. "Oh, mother!" Immediately turning her body, she dashed out the twig gate, almost falling flat on her face. With tears streaming down her face and hurried steps, she ran down the hill in front of the gate, crossed the stream, and entered the path through the soybean field on the opposite side. Where do you think you can go if you run away from me?" At this meaningful shout that seemed to block her path, the fleeing wife's legs faltered. She turned her head and looked at her husband, who was still standing inside the twig gate holding the stick. Like a child who had sinned against an adult, her lips merely twitched, until, afraid her husband might come running out, she barely opened her mouth. "I'll just go to Sodal's mother's house for a bit." After making a timid excuse, she hurriedly resumed walking her path. It wasn't as if the wife didn't know how urgently this 2-1 was needed right now, but given her qualifications and her labor, 2-1 was an amount she couldn't even dream of touching. Her earnings were trivial. As soon as she woke up in the morning, terrified of falling behind others, she would stubbornly head straight up into the mountains. It involved tying a small basket to her waist and searching for bellflower roots and bonnet bellflower roots sparsely scattered throughout the massive mountains. climbing up the steep ridges, dragging her frail body and bare feet in straw sandals into the deep mountains and through gloomy rock crevices. It felt as though the strength she used to nurse at her mother's breast was melting away, and cold sweat would pour down from her head to her toes. Her worn-out skirt, wrapped in a single layer around her lower half, clung damply to her legs and waist, hindering her steps. Her sweat-soaked calves were scratched and torn by the rough brush, the stinging pain beyond words. Furthermore, the heavy smell of the dirt pierced her chest, making it hard to breathe. Yet, in her innocent mind, struggling simply to survive, no complaints arose. When she occasionally spotted one or two bellflower shoots poking up sharply in the tangled woods, like a rare bean sprouting in a drought, she still broke into a smile brimming with joy. Sometimes she climbed rocks. If it was a place too rugged to climb, she would dangle from arrowroot vines. She would take off her grime-soaked cotton top, tuck it firmly into her waistband, and hang on to the mountains of Gangwon Province, known as tiger forests, desperately clawing her way around. Every time the valley wind passed, it blew the skirt covering her bare body into the air. If the arrowroot vines could see her unhesitatingly exposing her dark red buttocks each time, they would have laughed until their stomachs hurt. But fortunately, since it was a remote mountain valley, the only one mocking that sight was the cuckoo. Working furiously like this until sunset, the bellflower and bonnet bellflower roots she managed to dig up would amount to roughly half a bowl, or perhaps a little over a couple of bowls. Then she would come down to the village, go to the tavern street, hand them over, and trade the bowl's worth for barley. Lately, however, even that was out of season, so there was no yield. Instead, her daily life consisted of pounding other people's barley in the mill all day to get a bowl of cooked barley, bringing it home, and sharing it with her husband, who shamelessly idled about because he couldn't get any farmland. Considering this, let alone 2-1, it was questionable whether blood would even come out if someone slit her throat right then. If she were to somehow scrape together 2-1, she had no other option but to borrow barley from a household she knew and sell it. And besides Soidol's mother, whom all the village women gossiped about and secretly envied, saying she changed her destiny by swishing her skirt, there was no one who had money to spare. Yet, like a thief with a guilty conscience, she felt overwhelmed by her own wretched state and would rather die than go to the luxurious Soidol's mother. At first, Soidol's mother was just a lowly farmer's wife like herself, but somehow, with heaven's help, after she secretly became intimately involved with Mr. Lee, the rich nobleman of the village, she began to beautify her face, dress up in fine clothes, and live without worrying about meals, ending up with a destiny of rolling around on a golden cushion. Furthermore, Soidol's father, as if thinking this was a great stroke of luck, offered up his wife, turned a blind eye, and went about swaggering, wearing the clothes that came from Mr. Lee, eating the rice he provided, and washing his hands of his own farming, which had been lackluster year after year. Truth be told, the real underlying reason why Chunho's wife would rather die than go to Soidol's mother was precisely this. Just this past late spring, on a night when the moon was blindingly bright, Chunho had gone out to the mountain corner for a full moon gathering and hadn't returned, even though it was late. His wife, waiting at home, figured he would probably sleep over and was just lying down to fall asleep when some uninvited bull-like bastard burst in. He hurriedly threw himself upon Chunho's wife, but when she screamed in terror, he ended up just running away. Being a naive country matter, it was hushed up without much rumor, but it wasn't until a few days later that she finally realized it was the doing of Mr. Lee, the wealthy man of the village. Because of this reason, even though Chunho's wife had no direct conflict with Soidol's mother, she needlessly felt her face flush and grew extremely awkward whenever she faced her, as if she had committed a sin. And furthermore, when Soidol's mother gloated, swaying her body and saying, "New bride, I have 3 sets of undergarments and 4 pairs of traditional socks. She couldn't even raise her head out of shame, trapped in the paranoid thought that perhaps Soidol's mother had a bone to pick with her and was mocking her. On the other hand, the bitter pain tormenting her heart was not small. born from regret and lament over her own actions that had squandered such a golden opportunity, thinking that if only she had played her cards right, she could have been living in luxury like Sodal's mother by now. Yet, no matter what humiliation she might face, it would still be slightly easier to bear than her husband's ignorant beatings, which grew worse day by day. Today, she was determined to seek out Sodal's mother. With the singular anxious thought of whether this trip would end up in vain, Chunho's wife stepped onto the rice paddy path lined with drooping, weeping willows. For a country woman, she had quite fine features. Her slightly slender figure was slim, and her face was one that, as the village saying went, could attract quite a few affairs. However, her shabby clothes and musty smell made her look no better than a beggar. Taking turns with her left and right hands, she gathered the edges of her skirt and walked cautiously, afraid her bare flesh might show. Fierce clouds completely covered the vast expanse of the sky and gradually sagged down toward the earth until they tangled upon the mountain peaks, creating a dreary landscape. The sound of dogs barking from afar echoed quietly across the front and back mountains. Raindrops began to fall one by one, then gradually grew thicker, pouring down in heaps. Chunho's wife ran under the chestnut tree stretching over the road to take shelter from the rain, looking at Sodal's mother's house from afar. That house, nestled cozily and stylishly, surrounded entirely by a tall fence at the foot of the northern mountain, was the one. But seeing that the twig gate was tightly shut, it seemed Sodal's mother had gone to carry the evening meal out to the farmer's quarters and hadn't yet returned. She stood vacantly, waiting and watching for Sodal's mother to arrive. Raindrops fell steadily from the leaves, streaming down her cheeks and soaking into her breasts. Every time the wind blew past, it drove heavy rain against her body along with a chill. Her skirt, completely drenched in the rain, clung tightly to her body, revealing the bare contours of her waist, buttocks, and legs just as they were. She waited patiently, but Sodal's mother did not come. Feeling so exhausted that she was yawning and standing in a daze, she heard the sound of someone's footsteps coming from the hill on the left. She turned her head to look. Then, she swiftly hid her body in the gap between the trees. Mr. Lee, who had a potbelly, was walking down toward Sodal's house, holding a paper umbrella, waddling his buttocks. Although he was quite short, with his thick beard and the only horsehair cap in the entire village, he was a rather imposing nobleman around the age of 50. He went up to the twig gate and pushed it open without hesitation, as if it were his own house, and shamelessly went right inside. Seeing this, Chunho's wife, once again Fei, lit uneasy. She herself was a despised nuisance who wandered about getting beaten relentlessly, treated like a dog or pig. She could see that the measure of their human worth was strikingly different from Sodal's mother, who swayed about receiving double the affection both inside and out. As a reaction to looking up at Sodal's mother's luxury with so much envy, the absurd hope and regret of, if only I had done well too, twisted her heart with a bitterness several times more agonizing than before. As she blankly stared across at Sodal's house, a long sigh unwittingly rolled out of her. The muddy landslide water sweeping down from the hill loudly flowed over, covering her feet up to the insteps with mud. Her body, soaked through by the rainwater, gradually began to shiver. She shuddered lightly, and with a panicked gaze, she surveyed her surroundings carefully. No one was in sight. She turned her gaze back, glaring at that house while calculating inside. Surely Mr. Lee was the only one inside. Judging from the twig gate that had been latched until then, and the fact that the laundry hanging on the fence hadn't been taken in yet, she could swear on anything that there was absolutely no one else there besides Mr. Lee. Setting her mind at ease, she dashed through the rain toward that house. Hopping lightly onto the dirt floor entry room, she called out to make her presence known. "Is Sodal's mother here?" Of course, there was no answer from the person in question. Instead, at the sound of her voice, Mr. Lee poked his head out from the inner room like lightning. As if this was entirely beyond his dreams, he darted his eyes around, then sneakily and lecherously scanned Chunho's wife's breasts bulging through her clothes, her lower belly, her thighs, right down to the tops of her feet, before flashing a tipsy smile. Then he awkwardly stepped out into the dirt floor entry as well, murmuring as if it were a great pity. You mean Sodal's mother? Why, she just went out. She said she'd be right back, so if you'd just go into the inner room and wait. Where did she go in this rain? She just went right out here, but she'll probably be right back. I came thinking she was here. Disappointed, Chunho's wife muttered to herself like this, and after hesitating with a regretful look on her face, she stepped down from the entry room as if she were simply going to leave. Looking up at Mr. Lee, she gracefully said her goodbyes like a swallow skimming the water. Then I'll come back next time. Stay well. She said she'd be right back. Just wait a bit. I'll come again next time. No, wait a bit. Hey, listen here, hey! Fired up by Chunho's wife's attempt to leave, Mr. Lee threw caution and faced to the wind. He clumsily tried to stop her with all his might, but it seemed it just wouldn't work. Chunho's wife coming here was a great miracle in itself, but with the thunder and lightning and being in such a secluded spot, he would never see such a tempting opportunity again. His eyes rolled back. He yanked the long bamboo pipe from his mouth, tossed it into the room, and blindly grabbed the woman's waist from behind, dragging her up onto the dirt floor entry. The woman, deeply startled, whined and struggled to shake him off, saying, "Why are you doing this? Let go of this." "No, just wait a minute." Mr. Lee still wouldn't let go, trying to placate the woman with frantic glances. He kept hiking up his slipping trouser waist with his left hand while violently gripping the woman with his right arm, struggling anxiously because he didn't quite dare, until he barely managed to forcefully herd her into the room. The door ring was swiftly locked from the inside. Outside, the sound of harsh raindrops striking cabbage leaves and trees shaking in the wind was loud. Occasionally, heavy claps of thunder like rolling tin cans rattled the heated floors beneath the room, and the day grew steadily darker. Some time passed. Thinking she must be tamed by now, Mr. Lee breathed out a sigh of relief. Who? He looked with satisfaction at the woman who, thanks to the foolishly helpful rain, had been unable to throw a fit or act spitefully and was now lying submissively in front of his knees, giving her a sly smile. The woman was drenched in sweat all over, seeming quite hot. He pulled Sodal's mother's top off the wall and began to wipe the woman's body clean. From the tips of her toes to her face, "You're 19, aren't you?" Mr. Lee asked foolishly with an intoxicated face. "Yes," came the blunt, lackluster reply. Pressed down by Mr. Lee's hands, the woman couldn't get up and just lay perfectly still, as if dead. After finishing washing the woman's body, Mr. Lee let out a sigh and lit up a pipe. "So do you still get tortured like that by your husband these days?" he asked, and when there was no answer, "Good grief, how can you live like that? It's not just a day or two. Who knows what can happen with human affairs? If you happen to be beaten to death, you won't even have a place to file a formal complaint. So, if you value your life, it'd be better to just unconditionally split your household registry," he said, endlessly worrying for the woman's well-being, until suddenly he was curious about one thing. "Oh, right. I heard you had a child and it died?" "Yes." "Does it seem like you look like you've had one?" The woman's face turned as red as a carrot. Unable to say a word, she turned her head away. Mr. Lee didn't bother asking any further about such a thing, but suddenly an awful sour stench like rotting radish salad pierced his nose, and he couldn't help but frown. At first he hadn't realized it at all, but now that he noticed it, it thoroughly turned his stomach. Pointing clearly at the area around the woman's belly button with the bowl of his pipe, he said, "Hey, look at the grime on this skin. So water is abundant, yet you can't wash this?" Clucking his tongue in distaste, he acted annoyed as if his rare good mood had been ruined. However, when the woman, who had endured and endured, was finally overcome by embarrassment and tried to get up to put on her skirt, he suddenly flew into a rage. He snatched her clothes, flung them into the corner, and dragged her back down to that spot. Then, as if scolding his own daughter, he reprimanded her very broadly. "Why are you acting so hasty for a woman? You're not steady enough." Chunho's wife left that house about an hour after she went in. The rain was still pouring down steadily. She came out completely drenched in sweat. However, unexpectedly, no, by a stroke of heavenly luck, today's endeavor was a success. She lifted her body and beamed. Such insult and shame was a humiliation she had experienced for the first time in her life, a truly vile ordeal among ordeals, but a success was a success. Since receiving blessings must necessarily be followed by hardship, even if she had to endure this 100 times over, as long as she didn't get beaten by her husband and could live happily with him, she wouldn't refuse it. She regarded Mr. Lee as high as the sky, like a benefactor. She felt apologetic about his offer to give her husband farmland to work on if she would become his concubine. But furthermore, his promise to give her 2-1 and his request to meet him secretly around this time tomorrow at Sodol's house was more than anything else something she was grateful for, and her heart felt as light as if she had unloaded an overwhelming burden. The only thing agonizing her was that if her behavior were ever discovered by her husband, she would be beaten to death. Half rejoicing and half fretting, she lightly dashed down through the pouring rain towards her house. Chun-ho was still sitting alone, sulking, his anger unappeased. It had already been 3 years since he turned his back on his hometown of Inje. With poor harvests year after year, the crops with an air unspeakable, and the threats and abuse from the debt collectors grew worse by the day. Finally, having no other choice, he had abandoned his household belongings exactly as they were and fled empty-handed in the night. Seeking a better place to live, he dragged his young wife by the wrist, wandering over this mountain and that. However, the place he deliberately sought out was merely this village, and being deep in the mountains, it was no different. No matter which mountain village he went to and took up a hoe, he couldn't feel the slightest bit of attachment, and there, only chilly anxiety and starvation opened their arms to welcome him. Because he lacked a foundation, no one would give him farmland. With no work openings, he couldn't sell his labor. There was no food. In the end, he became feverishly swept up in the absurd spirit of speculation swirling among the increasingly impoverished farmers. Over the past few days, he had caught wind that a large gambling den was being held every night in the mountains right behind them. He loitered around trying to get a piece of the action, but he just couldn't scrape together the seed money. 2-1. If luck favored him and this 2-1 worked its magic, who could assert that he wouldn't instantly strike it rich? His grand scheme was to win 30 or 41, roughly pay off his debts in the village, have a suit of clothes made, and then leave this dreadful mountain village. If he went up to Seoul, he could have his wife work as a live-in maid while he did manual labor. And if the two of them earned money determinedly, they could have a comfortable life. He had no desire to starve to death in a mountain corner like this. So when he told his young wife to go get some money, she slithered this way and that, only avoiding his beatings without helping him out, which made her behavior exceptionally detestable. When his wife darted into the house looking like a drowned rat, before she could even open her mouth, her husband gritted his teeth and struck her fiercely across the cheek with his fist. "You bitch," quietly avoiding your beatings. "Where the hell have you been flopping around?" Getting struck on the cheek, the wife was stunned, her defiance catching in her throat. Still unsatisfied, as the husband went to grab the stick again, his wife was terrified and begged for her life with both hands, barely managing to open her mouth. "Tomorrow it'll be done. Tomorrow. The money? It'll be done tomorrow." Her voice, cautiously reporting that the money had been arranged, was half crying. The husband, half in doubt, squinted his eyes, then, "Tomorrow?" He raised his voice. "Yes, it'll be done tomorrow." "Are you sure?" "Yes, it'll be done tomorrow." Since the husband was well versed in the ways of the countryside, he didn't try to press and ask where or how out of the blue 2-1 was coming to be. With a somewhat relieved face, he sat on the threshold and lit his pipe. Only then did his wife also relax and start heading into the kitchen to boil the potatoes. But her husband walked over and stopped her, looking at her with pity. "You'll get sick. Go into the room and hurry up and dry your clothes. I'll boil the potatoes." A night as dark as ink descended. The rain grew louder, rattling the thin walls of their room front and back. The rain didn't leak from the ceiling, but since the house was old and the heated floor flues had practically collapsed, water seeped into the unpapered floor, making it unpleasantly damp. Furthermore, their bed was nothing more than 2 pieces of straw matting laid out starkly. With no kerosene lamp, it was pitch black, a sheer hell. Fleas continuously crawled around everywhere. However, completely accustomed to sleeping on the bare floor like logs, they nonchalantly lay side by side, attentively listening to the sound of the incessantly pouring night rain. Not knowing the tender affection between a married couple due to poverty and struggling, every day, amidst complaints and resentment through beatings, even they were unexpectedly harmonious on this night. Just by dreaming of the two, one that would land in the husband's arms. "When are we going to Seoul?" Lying with her head resting on her husband's left arm, the wife asked her husband in a somewhat whiny, coaxing manner. Having heard from her husband several times about the splendid streets of Seoul and its generous hospitality, she routinely daydreamed about it with an aching heart, though she had never actually seen it. She was desperate to quickly escape this hardship and go to Seoul, a good place to live. "We'll be going soon. It would be a breeze if only we didn't have a little debt. Even if we have to pay the debt later, let's go quickly. Don't worry, we'll definitely be going before the end of the month." The husband consented quite readily. Besides, he was known in the village as a skilled gambler, an expert capable of pulling out the winning card in a gambling den as easily as pulling bean sprouts from an earthenware pot. Thinking about dashing to the gambling den like lightning tomorrow night with 2-1 and raking in every single bit of money there, he was secretly delighted. And he inwardly boasted of his own clever sleight of hand, saying, "This is your first time in Seoul, right?" He put on airs just because he had breathed a little Seoul air once, shaking his wife's head with his arm as he asked. Since his temper was naturally hasty, he wanted to start making preparations to go to Seoul steadily right from now. His biggest concern was that if he took his wife, who had grown up in the middle of nowhere, she would be mocked by Seoulites, and there would be many embarrassing incidents. So he had no choice but to explain to his wife, one by one, the essential conditions she must follow when they go to Seoul. First, it started with a warning about dialect. The reason a farmer gets sniffed out by Seoulites under the nickname hillbilly lies above all in the dialect, so she should not use a dialect. She must change hapsa to hashimnika, formal do you do, and hageyu to how, polite do, but she shouldn't raise the end of her words. Furthermore, dawdling around in the streets is a dim-witted act declaring, "I am a country bumpkin," so she must walk her path briskly and look sharply with her eyes. These were the sorts of things. His wife listened closely to that awful sermon, saying, "Yes, yes," in a voice as quiet as a mosquito. The husband relentlessly and meticulously reinforced these warnings for about 2 hours, and as he plausibly described the customs and lifestyle guidelines of Seoul according to his own opinions, the end of his talk suddenly reached the topic of makeup skills. It was something he said because he had heard a rumor earlier that if a country woman went to Seoul and performed well as a live-in maid, she could even get a house of her own after a few years, but for that to happen, her face had to be pretty. So you have to apply oil every day, put on powder, and wear traditional socks so that you thoroughly please your master's heart. He was rattling on, highly excited for quite a while, when he heard a quiet breathing sound next to him. Turning his head, he saw his wife had already fallen completely into a deep sleep. "This damn thing, going to sleep while someone's talking," the husband muttered to himself, raising his right arm to stroke back his wife's disheveled hair over her forehead. The most precious thing in the world is his own wife. His heart ached as if his sin was too great, being a husband in name only, who hadn't been able to clothe her properly to this day and had only subjected her to immense hardship. With his rough arms, he tightly embraced his wife's waist and pulled her closely against his front. The sound of rain, which had poured relentlessly all night, barely stopped when morning arrived, and by lunchtime, even vibrant sunlight broke through. The gurgling, tear-evoking sounds of the water could be heard loudly. The shouts of children catching fish in the stream and the joyful folk songs of the farmers could also be heard vigorously. The rain seemed to have washed away Chunho's worries as well, for today a joyous light was visible in him too. "It must be about time for the evening meals. Hurry up and comb your hair and go." He grew thirsty with anticipation and continuously rushed his wife. "It's still a long way off." "What?" His wife was already sitting and combing her hair just as her husband had told her to, but because her tangled hair hadn't been washed in a good month, it took quite a bit of time. Having exchanged tender affection with her tiger-like husband for the first time in a long while, a rosy complexion rarely seen recently hovered on her face. At times, she even smiled brightly, looking quite charming. Seeing his wife dawdling was incredibly frustrating to watch. Her husband snatched the coarse comb right out of his wife's hands and refreshingly combed straight down through her hair. After completely combing it, he constantly dabbed his palms with water from the rice bowl placed nearby and applied it smoothly onto her head. Having done so, he smoothed down her hair from the top and neatly pinned it up into a stylish chignon, before putting the straw sandals he had painstakingly woven this morning onto his wife's feet, gently shaping them by tapping with his fists. "Now go," he said then. "Come right back, okay?" The husband had dressed his wife up so there would be no flaws and no failure, all in the desire to safely receive that 2-1. Just as the fiercely pouring rain shower eventually stopped, revealing the vibrant sunlight once again, our complicated and intense day today also quietly fades away with this night. I hope the old story I told you today has become a small resting place for your deep and peaceful sleep. So that this night is not too lonely, I will come back next time with an old story that comforts the heart. Slow night sleepy stories, I will say my goodbyes here for today. May clear and warm sunlight shine upon your tomorrow. Good night.